The dawn broke slowly over the jagged ridge of the mountains, casting a pinkish hue across the pine-speckled slopes and valleys. It should have been a morning like any other, quiet, serene, and heavy with the scent of evergreen dew. But the rumble of engines betrayed the peace long before the sun cleared the horizon. At the winding entrance of the gated community, a convoy of vehicles rolled in. Flatbed trucks carrying bulldozers, loaders, and an assortment of heavy machinery more suited for a construction site than a luxury neighborhood. Neighbors who had woken early for their jogs or morning coffee paused in disbelief, mugs in hand, as the convoy advanced toward the largest and most opulent home perched on the mountainside. That mansion, a sprawling estate of granite and glass, had always been the crown jewel of the development. Today, however, it was not the subject of admiration but the target of destruction. For months, whispers of the feud between the homeowner and the HOA had circulated through the community like wildfire. It had started innocently enough. A few letters about landscaping violations, fines over the brightness of security lights, disputes about the style of a gate that didn't conform precisely to the neighborhood's approved designs. Most residents shrugged at these matters, accustomed to the overzealous micromanagement of the board. But unlike others, the mansion's owner didn't bow his head or quietly pay the fees. He challenged the fines, ignored the deadlines, and even sent back a few letters of his own, filled with sharp words about freedom and private property rights. As weeks stretched into months, the fines piled up into astronomical sums. The board grew more irritated, and the standoff turned bitter. The demolition order, signed and sealed after a series of closed-door HOA meetings, had been the final step in what the board saw as righteous enforcement. They had painted the mansion's owner as a chronic rule breaker, a scofflaw who believed his wealth excused him from conformity. To the board, leveling the mansion was not only legal, it was symbolic. It would be a message to every resident who dared to question their authority. Compliance was not optional. When the machinery ground its way up the winding driveway, the operators wore expressions of professional detachment, but the HOA officials accompanying them radiated smug satisfaction. The mansion itself was a marvel of ambition, rising 3 stories high with cascading balconies that overlooked the valley. Its stonework had been quarried from the very mountain it stood upon. Floor-to-ceiling windows glimmered in the morning light, reflecting the fiery streaks of dawn. A copper roof, polished and regal, gleamed faintly as though to resist its fate. Inside, though no one could see it now, were hand-carved staircases, imported marble floors, and a grand hall with vaulted ceilings that echoed with the hush of mountain winds. This house had been the dream of its owner, a retreat from the bustle of the city, and a monument to what persistence and ambition could build. And yet, all that magnificence now stood at the mercy of roaring machines and men with demolition orders in hand. Neighbors gathered in clusters along the winding road, their voices hushed as though they were watching a sacred ritual rather than a bureaucratic enforcement. Some were sympathetic to the mansion's owner, whispering that the HOA had gone too far. Others, worn down by years of their own fines and warnings, found grim satisfaction in seeing someone else finally humbled. Children tugged at their parents' sleeves, asking why the castle on the hill was about to disappear, but the adults had no easy answers. They simply watched as workers uncoiled caution tape, set up barricades, and marked the perimeter of destruction. The first blow came from a steel-toothed excavator, its arm swinging forward with mechanical inevitability. The bucket slammed into the side of the mansion, sending shards of stone clattering across the driveway. The sound cracked the morning air like thunder, and gasps rippled through the onlookers. Birds scattered from the treetops, their wings a blur against the glowing sky. The excavator pulled back and struck again, tearing into the elegant facade as though it were nothing more than a paper model. Each impact shook the ground, rattling coffee cups in the hands of the astonished neighbors. Dust billowed into the sky, coating the pine needles and drifting across the valley in ghostly plumes. Inside the house, chandeliers crashed from ceilings, their crystals scattering across marble floors like spilled diamonds. Windows shattered outward, raining glass onto the terrace where just weeks ago, the owner had hosted a charity dinner that drew the elite of the region. The copper roof buckled under the strain of collapsing beams, bending like tin foil before crashing down in a fiery cascade of sparks. Every strike of machinery seemed to echo not only in the valley, but in the hearts of those who watched, as though something larger than stone and wood was being destroyed. The HOA officials stood in a line, arms crossed, clipboards in hand, their expressions a mixture of triumph and determination. Some even exchanged congratulatory nods, as if they were generals overseeing a decisive battle. To them, this was a victory years in the making, the toppling of arrogance, the enforcement of order, the solidification of their power. They took notes, snapped photos for their records, and whispered among themselves about how this act would be remembered in the community's history. Yet in their certainty, they failed to notice the unease growing in the crowd. Because among the whispers that spread from neighbor to neighbor was a revelation. A few knew the truth, and others pieced it together quickly. The mansion wasn't just a rich man's indulgence, nor was it some corporate retreat hidden in the hills. It was, in fact, the private residence of the sitting state governor. Purchased quietly years before, it had served as his escape from the relentless glare of politics and press. Few outside his inner circle knew the address, and the HOA, blinded by its obsession with rules and authority, had treated the property like any other. In their zeal, they had leveled not only a home, but the personal sanctuary of the state's most powerful figure. But that truth had not yet broken into the open. For now, all that could be seen was the spectacle of destruction. As walls crumbled, neighbors clutched their coats tighter against the chill that seemed to seep from the ruins. Some filmed the scene on their phones, their hands shaking as they captured the spectacle. Others turned away, unable to watch the obliteration of something so grand. Children cried as the final towers of stone toppled, sending clouds of grit rolling down the hillside. The air was thick with dust, sound, and an unshakable sense that this was not merely a house being destroyed, but a mistake of monumental proportions being made in real time. By the time the machinery paused, the mansion was half gone, its grandeur reduced to a skeletal ruin of fractured beams and smoldering debris. Smoke rose from the rubble as if the mountain itself mourned the loss. The HOA officials, satisfied, began signing off paperwork and discussing cleanup schedules. But in the crowd, unease had hardened into fear. They could sense what the officials could not. This demolition was not the end of a dispute. It was the beginning of a scandal that would rock the state to its core. The aftermath of the demolition unfolded faster than anyone in the mountain community could have imagined. By the time the sun was high over the valley, what remained of the mansion was a pile of rubble, twisted beams, and broken stone glinting in the harsh light. Neighbors who had stood in stunned silence during the demolition now pulled out their phones and began sending messages, posting videos, and sharing photos. Within hours, social media was saturated with clips of the colossal estate being torn down, hashtag spreading like wildfire. Hashtag Mountain Mansion, hashtag HO Revenge, and most explosively, hashtag Governor's House. That last revelation hit the internet like a thunderclap. Journalists scrambled to confirm what the whispers in the crowd had already established. The mountain retreat leveled by the HOA was indeed the private residence of the sitting governor. When the governor himself emerged from the state capitol later that afternoon, his expression was grim, his words carefully measured for the cameras. What happened today was not simply an overreach, he declared, standing before a crowd of reporters. It was an act of recklessness that trampled both property rights and common sense. My family's home has been destroyed, not by natural disaster, not by accident, but by an unelected board acting without proper oversight. His words reverberated across the state, carried live on television, and clipped into sound bites that dominated the evening news cycle. In the space of a single day, the HOA had transformed itself from a petty local authority into the centerpiece of a statewide scandal. For the board members, the shift was immediate and brutal. That morning they had basked in smug satisfaction, convinced they had cemented their legacy as strict enforcers of order. By nightfall, their names and faces were plastered across news outlets, dissected by pundits, and targeted by angry constituents demanding accountability. Some of them shut off their phones as death threats and angry calls poured in. Others sought lawyers, hoping to shield themselves from the storm of litigation already forming on the horizon. What they had envisioned as a display of strength had become a symbol of abuse, arrogance, and unchecked power. The community itself was thrown into chaos. Residents who had long chafed under the HOA's endless stream of warnings and fines now felt emboldened to speak out. At impromptu gatherings on driveways and porches, they swapped stories of harassment, intimidation, and petty punishments doled out by the board. One elderly woman recalled how she had been fined for planting the wrong variety of flowers in her front yard. A young couple described how the HOA had threatened to sue them for parking their camper van outside their own garage. Dozens of similar stories surfaced, painting a portrait of an association that had ruled not with fairness, but with fear. Meanwhile, the governor's allies seized the opportunity to rally public opinion. Legal experts went on television to explain how the HOA had overstepped its authority, while politicians from both sides of the aisle lined up to condemn the incident. If they can bulldoze the governor's house, one state senator thundered, then no homeowner in this state is safe from abuse. Petitions calling for the immediate dissolution of the HOA circulated online, gathering tens of thousands of signatures within hours. Calls for criminal investigations mounted, and before the week was out, the state attorney general had opened a formal inquiry into the board's actions. But the fallout wasn't limited to legal and political arenas. It reverberated deeply in the personal lives of those involved. The demolition workers, who had thought they were simply fulfilling a contract, found themselves questioned by investigators and reporters alike. Many insisted they hadn't known whose house they were destroying, that they were only following orders. Yet guilt hung heavy in their voices as they described tearing into the walls of a mansion that, in hindsight, should never have been touched. Neighbors who had cheered quietly at the start of the demolition now confessed regret, admitting they hadn't realized how far the board would go. The entire community, once considered an idyllic retreat in the mountains, became a cautionary tale plastered across the national press. As days passed, the ruins of the mansion remained untouched, a smoldering monument to hubris and folly. Tourists began driving up the mountain just to glimpse the site, snapping photos of the wreckage that symbolized the downfall of the once feared HOA. News vans parked along the narrow roads, their antennas stretching skyward, their reporters eager to broadcast every new development. What had once been a quiet, exclusive neighborhood was now the most infamous address in the state. The governor, though outwardly composed, moved swiftly behind the scenes. Lawsuits were filed, emergency legislation drafted, and committees convened to discuss reforming HOA powers across the state. What had begun as a local dispute was on the verge of reshaping laws for millions of homeowners. And at the center of it all stood the toppled mansion, proof that unchecked authority, no matter how small or local, could lead to ruin. For the HOA board members, the end came quietly but decisively. Facing mounting legal challenges, public outrage, and the near certainty of personal liability, they resigned en masse within 2 weeks. Their names, once spoken with fear at neighborhood meetings, now carried the weight of shame and derision. Some moved away, others stayed but lived as pariahs in their own community. Their attempt to project power had instead shattered their reputations permanently. The fallout rippled far beyond the mountains, reaching homeowners across the country who recognized their own struggles in the story. To many, it became a parable about the dangers of petty authority left unchecked. To others, it was a vindication of their frustrations with overbearing boards and endless fines. And for the governor, though the loss of his home was painful, the scandal gave him a powerful new platform, a chance to champion reform and stand as the unlikely face of ordinary homeowners. What began as a morning of dust and demolition ended as a turning point, a moment where the heavy hand of the HOA collapsed under the weight of its own arrogance. The house was gone, reduced to rubble, but in its place rose something unexpected. a reckoning that would reshape not only one community, but the balance of power between homeowners and the organizations meant to serve them.